Hello and welcome to the Wheeler Centre. It is, as always, a pleasure to be here. I'm Paul Barclay, host of Big Ideas on Radio National, for which this conversation is being recorded. I want to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. Tonight's conversation is presented by the Wheeler Centre and the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne, and we're going to be exploring the many ways we understand and experience dying, death and grieving throughout our lives, from how we communicate the inevitability of death to children, to the stories we tell ourselves and our loved ones about it as adults. I thought it was worth acknowledging that today is the 20th anniversary of the Bali bombing, in which 202 people died, including 88 Australians. Memorial services have been held around the country for that tragic event. Amongst the things we'll be discussing as well tonight are advances in technology and how they're affecting modern day death care. I tell you, I've been reading about death for the last couple of days, and there's a lot I didn't know, and I'm assuming that may be the case with you. Got fantastic panellists here to navigate us through this world. On my immediate left, I have Dr Hannah Gould, a cultural anthropologist working in the areas of death, religion and material culture, with a regional focus on East Asia and Australia. Her research examines the processes of disposal and divestment, both in regard to the human dead and material objects. Next to Hannah, we have Kimba Griffith, who is a holistic funeral director, ceremonialist, death doula, jazz singer and death disruptor. And couldn't we all do with a bit of death being disrupted? Perhaps postponed as well. I don't know whether we can guarantee that, though.
One, yeah.
As well as supporting people who have lost someone close, Kimba works with people facing life-limiting illnesses and those seeking to address voluntary assisted dying. Next to Kimba, we have Stacey Hamilton, who is a proud Wamba Wamba woman.
Wamba Wamba.
Wamba Wamba. Stacey, can I get you to properly identify your cultural background, because I'm feeling I'm going to make a complete hash of it. So,
Wurrung,
yeah.
Ngurai-Illum Wurrung and Wotjobaluk woman.
Thanks very much, and I apologise for my gutlessness in having a go at that. Stacey is the owner-operator of Melbourne's newest funeral service, Murrenda Memorial Services. Murrenda in Wamba Wamba means Wamba Wamba. I will get it. Wamba Wamba means to be alive. And at the end, I don't even know if I'm going to get to the speaker introductions at the moment, is Chloe Hooper, author of many books, her most recent being Bedtime Story, which is for sale tonight, by the way, which explores how to talk to children about death, one of the great taboo topics, but in ways that won't leave them afraid of life. Please welcome our fantastic panel of speakers. So, Kimba, you are, as I say, disrupting death and the rituals around it. How exactly are you disrupting death? Perhaps you could give us an idea of what a day in your life looks like as a death disruptor.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I created that title. I think it was bestowed upon us. But at the Last Hurrah Funerals, we have a continuity of care model, which is pretty different to most funeral companies. So what that means is that when a family comes, they work with one person. Usually that's me. So I'm a funeral director and a ceremony maker, celebrant, whatever you want to call it. I also work with people who are, dying or facing their own death or caring for someone who's dying. So they often ring us before that happens. And so that way they have a connection to someone. So when the death does come, their family, they know someone. So when they call me, it's not like, oh my God, what do I do? They sort of know. Or, that doesn't always happen. So I guess a day in the life for me could be seeing families who've lost someone, talking to our mortuary staff, working with my co-founder on creating ceremonies. So we do a lot of, for us, the funeral and the wake, are one thing. They're one ceremony. They're different parts of it. So we do a lot of helping with catering, going to Dan Murphy's, setting up all the, our funeral staff are both funeral staff and catering staff, creating the media, all that stuff. So basically it's just about taking each family through and helping them to get their vision of how they want to say goodbye. Whatever that is, we're there to help them do it. So.
Much more personalised than the template funerals that we've been used to in past decades. People are tending to increasingly reject, I think they're called McFunerals. Some are dubbing them.
McFunerals, that's a good one.
People are kind of rejecting that in favour of something that's more personalised. Perhaps you could just give us an example, one or two examples of some funerals recently that are really mixing it up.
One short point. I don't like the term personalisation because I think that automatically, if you're thinking that way, you've got it wrong, because that means you're personalising a template that already exists, and I think that becomes very limiting. So, for example, recently we worked with a young woman who was dying of cancer, who was a musician, and we sort of worked with her through our philanthropic arm. So we've got a philanthropic arm that provides free or low-cost funerals for people who can't afford it, particularly musicians and skaters, because that's our people. So I worked with her in the hospital. She didn't really want to talk about her death. She found that really hard. It wasn't much fun because she was so young. But I just sort of said, so I talked to her about what kind of living wake would you like? She wanted to do a living wake. We didn't get there. So she wanted an I Dream of Jeannie. That was the theme. So we had no chairs except in the back for the older folks who couldn't sit on rugs or cushions. Everyone bought rugs, cushions, and the whole space was just, decked out. We had a table of her objects to give away so people could take, because she was a bit of a hoarder because she was a musician and we just had this crazy day of someone played the sitar and sang. It was just, totally her. And another one that we did that was a little while ago is we did one at the Tote. I don't know if you guys know the Tote. It's a really grungy pub in Collingwood, and we basically had a Viking metal band, and they played they played in the funeral, and they were all there, and so the coffin, when people were moshing around the coffin, that was a bit nerve-wracking. And then at the end, the Vikings carried him out to the hearse. We blocked, the whole of Johnson Street, and then they were like, do a doughy. I didn't do a doughy, but I did burn a little bit of rubber. So that's just two, but, there's anything you want. It doesn't have to be that wild either, but they're just two.
So, Hannah, Kimba's talking there about how our attitude to the rituals around death are changing. Is that emblematic of broader changes in the community? What is our attitude to death care, and what are some of the changes that we are seeing more broadly?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see most people having Viking mosh pits and sitar, I Dream of Jeannie ceremonies anytime in the future. But
more's the pity, really.
I mean, I wish. But, what we are seeing is that once Australians, I think, were very much committed to church funerals, and particularly, Christian church funerals, and we can see the influence of Christianity waning in Australia. If you look at the most recent statistics from the census, we see that for the first time, the Australian population has dipped under 50% for Christianity. But even those who are Christian, right, even those who might be non-religious but spiritual, they did some yoga, they have a book of Buddhist sayings on their nightstand, whatever it is, they might be looking for new ways to make meaningful funerals, right? And where in the past you when you're approaching your end of life at the funeral, you kind of knew what was going to happen, right? It was what your parents did, what your grandparents did. Now we have generations of people who, they've been to their grandparents' funerals, they've been to their parents' funerals. Maybe they organised their parents' funerals. They didn't really like it. It was hello, the words didn't have any meaning, maybe they weren't personal enough for them. And so they're searching for something new. And this kind of drive towards personalisation is a really massive force that's shifting Australian funerals. And some of the industry, some smaller players, people who spend a lot more time with families, are able to respond to that. But for the most part, these large-scale death care providers, these huge funeral companies, are really struggling to provide personalisation at that scale. And so we have that disconnect where sometimes, we don't like to say that, oh, that was a bad funeral, but I'm sure everyone in the room has been to funerals that are better and worse, right? And so a bad funeral, a worse funeral, can be a really stressful and I think sad experience.
So why are they struggling Are they struggling with the changing times? Are they struggling because there are regulations and conventions that hold them back? What's the struggle?
There's a few things. It's a huge amount of effort, the amount of effort and time that Kimba and others put in to talking to families and getting to know them. Larger players don't necessarily want to invest that amount of time. Frankly, they don't necessarily have the staff. You talk to most funeral homes, the number one kind of pressing issue for them is a HR crisis. It's really hard to convince people to work in death care. Yeah. I mean, we've all been talking about it, and this is part of our lives, but there still is stigma associated with being a funeral celebrant, with being a funeral provider. It's a job that's often been feminised, right? It's associated with effective labour, with personalisation, emotional labour. We know that feminised industries that women dominate, are paid worse. And so it's a really difficult thing for them to get the staff and to then retain the staff to allow them to do the work, to make that more personalised. And so partially what we're seeing then is the industry's failing, but then we're also seeing a lot of families step up and step in and do some of that work that funeral homes usually would have done. So whether that's driving to Dan Murphy's or, going to Officeworks and printing out the orders of service, putting together the PowerPoint themselves, doing a lot of that work themselves because funeral providers aren't necessarily doing it for them.
Yeah, we'll keep talking more about how this is changing, but Chloe, I want to bring you into the discussion. Your book, Bedtime Story, explores your quest to talk to your own children about death when their father, your partner, Don, became ill. Talking to children seriously about death is not something we do. It's not something we even really talk about much. How did you approach this task? Unenviable task.
Well, so their dad was diagnosed with an aggressive leukemia, and I turned to the bookshelf, and they have books. My kids have books on sort of everything from the inside of an aeroplane to how to make pizza and different jobs everybody does. I mean, and I just thought, there's got to be the perfect book for us here. And I guess I was telling myself a fairy story that there would be, this book would start with dark colours, and in the end there'd be a sort of fireworks, and there'd be some roadmap of how to deal with this. And but actually on the shelves are lots of singing and dancing animals. And I guess, as I started to look through children's literature, from the Brothers Grimm, fairy tales that had, were kind of soaked in death because people, those stories or the written versions of them followed the plague. Through to Harry Potter or contemporary children's fiction, it really sort of gave me an education on how we've dealt with death in Western children's literature. And then I guess my eyes were opened even to the fact that here I am reading about like a rabbit being tucked into bed throughout an extinction crisis. I mean, I also started thinking much more about the death. We're very interested in our own mortality, and we sort of sometimes don't integrate, the natural world around us and what's happening to the ecosystems that support us. Just to, if we were upbeat talking about death, I thought I'd bring it down.
The death of the planet. I imagine, though, that most of us, when confronted with the circumstances that you found yourself confronted with, may think in the back of our minds that, yes, it's time to have the big talk about death with the kids. But this is something that one presumably pushes away. You and Don eventually do sit down and
Yeah.
talk to especially your older boy.
Yeah.
You write about it in the book, this moment. Tell us about that. Tell us about that chat, what he said to you, how you found the words to get into that conversation, and how well you thought that conversation went.
Well, it's lucky that you don't have one conversation. But I mean, there's terrific material that's available and easily available, resources for parents in this situation. And one of the sort of striking things for us was we told our son we had important news to tell him, and he didn't yet know that he was meant to sit down. That when somebody tells you bad news, you sit down. And so he's kicking around a balloon. Pretending he's a football star. And it's sort of, we were, uptight, like we were still in the doctor's office. And, one thing that you're prepared, that the sort of resources prepare you is to don't claim that you're not going to die. And, of course, Don said, don't worry, I'm not going to die, just before he sort of has chemotherapy the next day. And luckily he's in remission, so,
Yep.
but...
he was telling the truth.
Well, we all have the Damocles sword. It's just sort of, you can feel it a little closer to your neck sometimes. But to tell the truth, and that was a revelation. Oh, did everyone else know you're meant to be honest with your kids? And actually, by not telling them what was going on, we'd had sort of months of sotto voce conversations, and a horrible secret had grown in our house, which had actually sort of infected everything else. And of course, kids know. They're smarter than we are. In the end, I was looking for a story, I think, to tell myself as much as I was to tell them. And I now, my sort of revelation was actually, there are some really great books, and introduce them to kids' literary diets early, because then they have a sort of cosmology with which to deal with these questions. And once you do start talking to kids about mortality, you have an opportunity to talk about what is the best way to live, how do we want to live our best lives. And that was a really crucial lesson for me too.
Of the questions that Tobias asked, I think my favourite was, when you die, does all of your skin disappear? Which is such a kid question, isn't it?
Well, I think in cartoons, suddenly just someone sort of sticks their finger into a socket and then they're like instantly a skeleton. So it may, he was on the money.
He was following something.
That sort of, can I say one thing on that? Because I just dealt with a family who their dad suicided and he had 5 kids. And we had a vigil with him and his little 6-year-old. And the kids were amazing. Like we had some pencils and that set up, and they'd come over and they'd have these moments, and then they'd be like overwhelmed and they'd just go and start drawing. But he was so fascinated. He was asking me all these words. He's like, he's very cold. And I said, yeah, he is. He's been in the fridge. And he was like, is he cold everywhere? And I was like, yep, he's cold. And he's like, even like down there? And I was like, yeah, he's cold everywhere. And he was like, oh, I'm going to feel his ears. Yep, they're cold. And then he was like, his hair's wrong. So I was like, let's do his hair. So we did his hair together. And I was just really amazed at how, it was clearly traumatic, but he was not kind of denying it. He knew what had happened, and I think a lot of times when people want to shield children, I think they're actually, like maybe you said, they're shielding themselves a little bit.
Amazing, yeah. Stacey, there are many kind of barriers that get in the way as to whether we can access a good death. I mean, I don't even know whether this term, a good death, is a term. Maybe we'll come to that a little bit later on. But what are some of the kind of structural barriers facing Aboriginal people who are dying, and their ability to have a good death? And by that, I suppose I mean some of the examples that we've heard already.
I think one of the biggest things is that we don't have anything specific here in Australia where we can take the family. For example, like in New Zealand, you have the maraes where you can take them, and the whole family are there, everybody's there. And we really need something like that. And it's somewhere where you can bring in culture. You can do things like your smoking ceremonies and everything like that, and just be together like you need to. That's probably one of our biggest things that we need. There's also things like the hospitals. They don't have culturally safe spaces for families to come into. A lot of the hospitals will have a multi-religion space or whatever, but it's not a cultural space. They don't have areas big enough for the whole family to come in. And then you've got all these policies and rules and that restrict families, and they don't class extended family as family. So that there's those sorts of barriers. Then you've got other. There's so many. Oh my goodness, I could go on forever, but I'll try and keep it down. You've got issues like, deaths in custody. That's another area where every other culture or religion can have somebody come in where that person has passed. Other cultures, they'll let their religious person or minister or whatever their cultural thing is come in and bless that area or do whatever, but they do not let Aboriginal people come in and smoke the space, which is really, really important in Aboriginal culture. Smoking means cleansing, and you don't want the thought of that person still in that cell after they've passed or still somewhere, where they shouldn't be. You need to cleanse it. And you also need to cleanse it for future people coming through as well, You've got to make the whole space clean. And they don't allow that in the prisons either. There's also the other things with hospitals, the financial stuff that comes with someone being in hospital. You ever rushed off to emergency and not taken your purse or something, then you're locked in parking. You can't get out. You could be there for days, no money for food or anything else. There's all of that. It's so complex. There's so many different things that impact. The suicide rate is higher for Aboriginal people. There's no funding for funerals. And one thing I hear quite often, why do we have to pay? This is our land. Why do we have to pay for a burial? This is our land. You get a plot out at Fawkner, you're looking at $13,500. Who has that kind of money laying around? I know I don't. And then it's pushing families out further. And they're also, you'll find the big mainstream cemeteries do not have Aboriginal specific areas. They have different religious areas, I don't even know them. The Greek Orthodox and the Catholic and the Anglican and all of them, but they do not have Aboriginal areas. In saying that, we do have some Aboriginal cemeteries. There is one out at Greenvale, Wurrung, beautiful place, absolutely beautiful. And it doesn't look like your standard cemetery, so they're not all lined up in straight lines or anything. Very lovely place.
Is this because there's a lack of cultural awareness, or is it that there are other barriers that are stopping, for example, large hospital institutions from integrating some of these practices?
Well, they've got their own policies and that restrict things. There is that lack of cultural awareness, and then you get the tokenistic things. So, that a hospital might employ an Aboriginal liaison, but they're just a tick box. They've got no authority, no power, no nothing. You will find in the regional areas, but they're a little bit more better because most of the people at the hospitals know the families, they know the communities, so they're a little bit more open to doing things a little bit different. But in Melbourne and that, they don't have that.
I would say that entirely in addition to that, and I think you've articulated extraordinarily the different kind of every single stage from end of life through to the memorial, all of those different structural barriers, right? One of the, I think, challenges that's added to that is just how we regulate and think about death care in Australia. We have a healthcare system that we actually think of as a healthcare system. It's holistic. There's multiple different disciplines that work in that. We fund it well through a public system, sometimes not so well. We don't have a death care system. We don't think about it as an integrated, holistic system. We don't provide as many resources for it, for example. There's so many discontinuities between you go to the hospital, then you go to the hospice, and then all of a sudden you have to go to a funeral director, and then you have to go to the cemetery. They're all run by different companies. None of them talk to each other. Maybe they're rivals trying to get money off each other. And, we don't have a minister who's directly representative for the death care system.
They're all death ministers.
They're all death ministers. Well, none of them are death ministers. If you asked, well, who's the minister responsible for Australian cemeteries, for Victorian cemeteries, I doubt anyone would know who even to write to.
Is that a reflection of our culture, that we just don't talk about death generally in Western culture, or certainly haven't done? Perhaps we're doing it a little bit more now, but traditionally that's not been the case.
It hasn't been the case, and I think, none of these politicians, as I always say, that, the dead are not really a great voting bloc. In the November election upcoming, there's not really a vote for the dead, right, that we're trying to capture.
Sometimes there have been some dead people who voted, actually,
okay, well,
but that's
let's not
another
go
story.
down that. So it's difficult to mount kind of political, I suppose, energies towards changing the system. But also in many ways, it's just that when we think about our, how we fund life and death, we always think about, when you build a new suburb, we think, okay, where are these people going to shop? Where are they going to go to school? Where's the swimming pool? Where's the library? You don't think about where they're going to die. Death care is not thought of as a vital public infrastructure in the same way it should be, right? And because of that, it's not funded, it's not regulated, it doesn't have the same supports.
And the point actually that Stacey made about
it's massively
the
expensive.
plot at Fawkner costing $13,000. I live just near the Carlton Cemetery.
Oh, that's an expensive one.
$50,000.
Yeah.
For
It's based on land value in that area.
Yeah.
So if you look at, what they was doing was pushing people out further, but we're building out further, so that land value is going higher and higher.
Yep, and also, you want cemeteries that are accessible for loved ones, family, friends who want to visit. And if the only place we can afford to build cemeteries is out on the fringes of our
Where there's no
city,
public transport.
where there's no, yeah.
Just one thing on the death care, it's just very interesting that we always joke, because, you have to have a dark sense of humour in this field, that every time we have to ring a hospital because someone's died, they're always like, sorry, what, like no one dies at a hospital, right? They don't understand. And, I know that, say, for example, Peter Mac, great hospital, excellent care, beautiful facilities, they built that hospital with no mortuary, right? There is no mortuary at a cancer hospital, which means that just like a nursing home, like you can understand how a nursing home doesn't have a mortuary because you need to quickly remove the dead. Same thing at Peter Mac. They don't have anywhere to put the people that have died, and it just blows my mind that they would build a hospital like that, expecting no one's going to die there. So I think that's another thing. Until we get past that barrier of even healthcare systems accepting that death can be an endpoint, I think it's going to be very hard.
And that's where the biases of the medical system, I suppose, bleed into the biases of the political system, right? Where we still think about death as a failure, right? I teach first-year medical students, and we've just started a new subject with them, which is Death 101 in the first year. And we spend the first couple of weeks just trying to get them to say the D word.
Yeah.
Right? Just trying to get to them to come to the facts that, yes, you are a healthcare professional. Guess what, guys? You're also death care professionals. And everyone that comes into your office, every person you see, you're either helping them die later or helping them die well. Right? And you need to be part of that system, because unless we can change it from that stage, when it gets down to memorialisation and ceremony, it's not going to change.
There is this thing, Chloe, anticipatory grief, which is the feeling of grief or loss that is felt before a death occurs. Presumably this was the kind of stuff you had to talk to your kids about. In fact, perhaps you yourself had to deal with as well. How do you discuss the prospect and possibility of death when it's not certain, and when, of course, you're hoping it doesn't happen? How do you help kids get a handle on that? Because it's uncertain, it's worrying, but also you want them to start thinking about it.
Well, I listened to a father who'd lost a son in the Bali bombings on the radio today
Yeah.
for the anniversary, and I was struck by him talking about his future being taken away. That his son would have been 40 now, that he might have had grandchildren. He's missed seeing the kind of person that he felt his son was going to be. I suppose when you have a loved one with a potentially fatal illness, there's a sense that the future that you imagined is evaporates. But I guess that that's actually been used I'm sitting in a sort of privileged position at the moment because my husband's in remission, but none of us know what our future is going to look like, and so I think that there is actually opportunity and a freedom in then focusing on how you live in the present, and that has been really important to me, and actually to not. You don't sort of in your psychic landscape lay out the cemetery right at the back or on the edges where no one can go to. Actually, there is a power in realizing that is central, and I guess that it goes to the point of language, using the D word, not being scared of it. We in the parallel is that sort of 20th century children's literature, it really almost after the Great War, when Peter Pan kind of flew in the nursery window and never wanted to grow old. We've had this idea that people die in out of sight in nursing homes, and we use these sorts of euphemisms. So it's the fallen, and they've succumbed, or they've gone to sleep, and all of these ways that we couch this, we
you also
need to
say
reimagine.
You say that children are natural philosophers who are intrigued by death, and you actually think that we should add this topic into their literary diet from a much younger age.
I do. I mean, it was really interesting, Kimba, when you were talking about the boy asking about is his father cold, because often that is really common that children wonder about a loved one who's buried. Are they cold down there? Are they hungry? So actually sort of synthesising the physiology of death is one thing, and then the spiritual is kind of overlaid on top of that, and I think Stacey, you could talk to this. I think it's in an Aboriginal culture, unfortunately, death is kind of all around.
We live it.
Yeah, you're living
every day.
it. Yeah,
you grow
sorry
up with
business
it.
is
and so
happens.
I'm sitting here listening to this, going, "Oh wow, a book? Yeah, okay, that's something new." Because the whole process, our kids are with us the whole way. They're in the hospital, they're in at the funeral home, they're at the cemetery, they're every part of it. So you grow up with it. My whole life it was just normal. So I never had to ask them questions. Because that's what it was. I don't even know how many funerals I went to before I even became a part of the industry. It was, and then coming into the industry was just automatic because that's what I've always done. So I've been to funerals where kids are just casually walking by, and we quite often have open coffins. That's very common for us. And, they're coming up and they're having a chat. Hey, how you going? And, I remember one funeral I was down in Gippsland and all the grannies were coming up and they're just like, oh, hey, Nan, and just... It was just normal. It wasn't hard. It was just normal.
Well, I had a problem because I'd come from this sort of repressed whitey kind of, background where I wasn't allowed to go to my grandmother's, who I adored, her funeral because it might have upset me, and that's like as a teenager. So it's completely,
So it's really foreign for me when somebody says, are we allowed to bring the kids? What? That's a question? Okay. Of course you are, but it's an eye-opener for me too, because I grew up a certain way and that's what I'm used to. I didn't realise that other people didn't grow up that way until I started coming across it. I thought everybody had open coffins at the funeral. I thought everybody spoke to the dead and done all that. I just thought that was normal until other people were saying that it wasn't.
Stacey, can I ask you, for many First Nations people, it's important for them to die on country.
Yes.
How difficult is that to facilitate?
Well, going back to the hospital stuff, when people are moved off country to go to get better health care at a bigger hospital or something, they're away from family, they're away from country. It's really sad and it's scary. They're alone and they're not in a safe space. And one of the first things I say to families when I get a call, because I do funerals everywhere, all across the state and everything, so I might get a call from Shepparton, and the first thing I'll say is, where are they? And if they're on country, I say, do you realise that I will be taking them off country? And that's really important. They need to know that. Because a lot of them, they don't realise. They think they're either at the hospital or somewhere local. They don't realise that we actually move them, take them away. So it's a very important question, and that's one of the biggest things we do is take people back to country. So, for instance, coroners, everybody comes down to Melbourne, Victoria, wherever you pass, you come down here. So one of our big things is taking people back to country. It's really, really important. The hospitals and that, when you take people away, depending on where you are, you can be miles and miles away from your family and they've got no access to you, you've got no access to them. They could be in a remote area where they don't even have mobile coverage or anything, so you couldn't even ring them. And then you've got the hospital restriction. So if everybody travelled down and everything, then you're restricted.
Yeah.
You can't even come into the hospital. You can't even do nothing. I had a recent experience when you're talking about Peter Mac. I had a cousin that just recently passed at Olivia Newton-John, and we were only allowed 2 people there. And as soon as she passed, so we were rotating in and out of the hospital. We weren't even allowed to take a hot drink up there, nothing. And as soon as she passed, I'd walked in, and that meant there were 3 people in the room. And the nurse came in and said, "Get out. You need to get out. Somebody in here needs to get out."
Yeah.
It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. We spent a whole week rotating through there, and were only allowed to sit in the cafe when it was open, and then you had to go up to Olivia Newton-John to sign in first before you can go into the cafe. And they had no space. You couldn't make a cup of tea. You couldn't do nothing. Whereas just after that, I had another cousin in Bendigo Hospital, and they had a whole space where we can go and sit. So we were all there. We could make a cup of tea and everything. So it's really different across the board.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I am interested in, Hannah, on how different cultural traditions are making their way into death care in Australia. We've heard a little bit about Indigenous cultural practices around death. You've told us about how traditional Christian funeral services are kind of declining a bit. You're also studying dying Buddhish in Australia, researching dying Buddhish in Australia. Tell us a bit about how Buddhist traditions are making their way into death care in Australia.
Yes, I think this is really particularly, and I will say, Stacey, one of the interesting things, or terrifying and sad things, often those things align, unfortunately, being a scholar, is that, during COVID in particular, those kind of restrictions and I think that cultural blindness in death care was exacerbated, right? We had these kind of restrictions on how many people can go to a funeral or whatever without any kind of sensitivity to what those numbers mean for particular religious and cultural traditions. So what we're seeing in Australia, obviously, is we have, increased religious diversity and we have increased ethnic diversity and demands on our death care system to respond to that. But then we also have this huge population of people who maybe call themselves, I'm not really religious, but I'm spiritual, or, I don't really know, but, as I said, I practice yoga and I've got some Buddhist books on the bookstand. There are a population sometimes people call nightstand Buddhists, or they call them Buddhish. And it's an interesting group of people because historically, if we think about our hospice system, hospices have been set up based on a Christian model, and it very much comes out of the UK and Cecily Saunders and this kind of movement for hospices and compassion and all the prejudices that came along with it in regards to homosexuality and HIV and all those other things. But now we're also seeing people who perhaps at the end of their lives want to turn to some different spiritual cultural traditions. So I'm talking to people whom, for example, have never really told anyone that they're spiritually particular, but when they tick their hospital admissions forms, all of a sudden they tick Buddhist, which is interesting, and nothing usually happens to it, except sometimes when a Buddhist nun suddenly gets a call and says, "We need you to send in a Buddhist." And the Buddhist nun says, "Well, which one? Which culture? Which tradition?" You know, this is one of the world's largest religions, and you have 17 different check boxes for Christians, but you've got a Buddhist. And, you know, the interesting thing here is unless you tick one of those boxes, you don't necessarily have access to spiritual support, right? So we have all these kind of different ways in which Australians are living meaningful spiritual lives that don't necessarily align with our death care systems. They're hitting and attack them. So we need to find ways, I think, to allow people of different faiths, but also of no faith, right, who just want to be spiritual or find meaning, to be able to access those services at the end of their lives.
Kimba, as a funeral director, you've worked with grieving persons from different religions and backgrounds and traditions. What would you say are some of the big misconceptions and myths around grieving and mourning?
There's so many. I think that idea of the stages of grief.
The 7 stages.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's very much a seminal text and like Kubler-Ross, like a lot of great things. So don't want to diss her too hard.
Shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance and hope, processing
I give you permission as a scholar to diss her pretty hard.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hannah. Yes, those. Now, I think all those things happen in a grieving process, but I liken it to a scribble, just a big scribble. And, you know, there are lines in the scribble, but they don't, you know. So that's one, was like you will go through all those stages in different orders and over again, and over time, you know, it'll probably get easier. But then the other thing is that, you know, that you process grief in a certain phase or way. I lost my dad in 2020, and what shocked me was how grief comes and grabs you at really weird times, like when you're not expecting it. And it can be, you know, really overwhelming when that happens. And like for me also, like just recently I thought, you know, that I've really done well. I've been processing my dad's grief, and I've just realised, actually I was kind of just, you know, I was burying it down with the rest of the grief that I bury down, that I'm immersed in every day from other people, and it's kind of reared up, you know. So there's things like that. And I think just this idea that you have to grieve in a certain way. And on that comes back to, like, if you're an atheist, you can still have a really, really meaningful funeral that is incredibly deep and moving and touching with no spiritual aspect at all. You know, it's completely possible, and we specialise in that. I mean, we do spiritual funerals, Buddhist funerals, you know, we do shy away from the religious ones a bit, and we don't really do Catholic ones. It's just a choice that we've made.
They probably don't want Viking death metal bands playing at their
Never
funerals
know.
anyway. Or
Probably not.
Maybe I'm making an assumption.
Probably not. But look, you know, like we're doing a nice Baptist one. We are getting a lot of older people now as well. So that's the thing. Like we don't just do these kind of like funerals, you know, we do whatever funeral you want to do. But I think that's another misconception, that, you know, if you have an atheist or humanist funeral, that it's going to be void of some kind of emotion. It's not at all. It just is about bringing that person into the room. And that idea that, you know, that's hard to do, I think is another myth. Yeah.
The convenient aspect of conventional Christian belief around death, Chloe, is that it does provide a nice, neat explanation. If you're a secular family, how do you go about explaining to your children what happens when we die? Was that something that came up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because that, you know, once the person is in the ground or burnt, you know, where do they go? And you know, I think there are sort of one way to answer that is to say, well, what do you think? And partly that gives an adult time to steady their nerves to continue the conversation. Yeah. And you know, I've took my sons through various different theories about what can happen, and from Buddhist to the idea that you return to country, to saying in our cultural tradition you go to heaven, and he was just like, oh, what would you do there? You know, yeah, like it's just dead people. And I ended up with like, I don't know. And I think that's also an acceptable answer, because we kind of don't really know.
It's kind of the only answer, really, isn't it? Is there such a thing as a good death? What do we think about this idea of a good death? I think Kimba, you were saying you wanted to make...
I think it depends on your perspective, really. It's your own personal perspective.
Okay.
So, and there's a lot of different scenarios. So, like someone, who was sick for a long time, you'd think of a good death is nice and quick in their sleep. Or quick is the fastest. Or a planned death could be a good death. You know, you've got everything planned, you know what you want. But, you know, death is scary for a lot of people. A lot of people don't even believe it exists. It's just like, it's not a thing. So they don't even think about it. But there are many different things you can do, like what you do, you know, with your death doula stuff. You know, you're with them for a long time leading up to it. And
unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to have a good death. So this is the thing. So I think there's things you can do to...
Can I just get you to explain, now that the term death doula was used, just what a death doula does?
Okay, so a death doula, it depends, the end-of-life consultant, amicus mortis, death doula, end-of-life companion.
Yep.
So it's basically a very varied role. It could be helping them with advanced care planning, living wills, you know, all of that paperwork, medical power of attorney. You can do all that stuff. It can be talking to the person about what sort of death they'd like to have, knowing that it's just a conversation that you can't guarantee, helping. Often their family doesn't want to talk about the fact that they're dying, and the dying person's like, I really need to talk about the fact that I'm dying. You know, it can be that. So it can be brokering conversations. It can be, a lot of people think of a death doula as like sitting vigil with the person, you know, at their death, on the deathbed. But to be honest, in my experience, when a person's actively dying, they don't really need you much.
Yeah.
The family may. And I always say, I'm a birth attendant too, so I always say at a birth you make cups of tea, and at a death you pour vodka. But yeah, so there's that.
Okay, so that's the death doula, and so you were saying that you could perform that task as well as you possibly could, but it's still not going to guarantee a good death.
Not at all, because I think the thing about it is, so if you do all those things or whatever, and then the person has a really difficult death, and there are some kinds of cancers particularly that some are better than others in terms of, like, you're going to die from both of them, but, you know, you'd rather die from that one than that one. But if the person doesn't end up having a great death, then the family can be left feeling guilty or ashamed that they didn't give their person a good death, you know. Or, for example, like the idea of a quick death. Now, look, that could be great for you, the dying person, you know. So, like, you just drop dead of a brain aneurysm, you know. But like we had one of those recently, and the person, it was Father's Day, and he was a young man, put his kids in the car and dropped dead on the ground next to the car. Like, you know, so for him, he probably didn't suffer at all. But for the family, that is just a terrible death, you know. So I just think the concept, it's more of like, I think Chloe was saying stories we tell ourselves, you know, like not saying you can't. I've been to some beautiful deaths too, like really incredible, you know, like some of the Buddhists say, you know, like you die as you live, but I don't know if that's fully true either. But, you know, I have been to some really beautiful deaths, but I don't know whether it was anything they specifically did other than maybe, you know, definitely having the palliative care come in as early as possible. That's one thing. The earlier you access palliative care, actually the outcomes are better for you and you may live longer. But yes, I just have a little bit of a problem with that concept.
And I think Stacey, you believe that having a death plan is very important.
Well, yeah, you need a plan because, especially now, you see so much conflict when someone passes. And to have a plan can help with that process, right down to who's your next of kin and stuff like that. Trying to determine that can be a nightmare these days. This is where, for Aboriginal people, law versus law comes into it. So, you know, traditionally we have a hierarchy and you have a matriarch or a main person that will look after all of that regardless. But law changes that. And then they can determine someone else to be the next of kin and stuff like that. So it can get really messy. So to have a plan helps with that process. And, you know, it means planning is everything, right down to, you know, what you want yourself for your own funeral. You know, some people have some awesome ideas what they want.
You then have to, though, Hannah, have faith that the people who are living will carry through your wishes. Is it a problem that people see some unconventional funeral plans and the people who are there to implement them actually don't? They renege on some of
People can leave some pretty unrealistic requests in their funeral plans. So a recent Victorian Law Commission actually looked into this and, you know, I don't know if people in the room know, but they might be sad to hear that, you know, your end-of-life wishes actually don't have a legal weight outside some very specific documents around things like interventions in medical care. But your funeral wishes don't have any legal weight. So you can have a conversation. The best thing to do is to have your next of kin, get them on board. You know, they know what you want and they'll be able to provide it for you. But if you write down on a piece of paper, I desperately want to be cremated, you know, please cremate me and I want to be shot into space, right? You know, whatever it is, or, you know, which you can do. I want my ashes scattered across the Great Ocean Road via drone, also an option that you can do in Victoria. Those requests don't have any legal weight, right? And I think for very obvious reasons, we'd have to put limits on what you could request in that kind of way. And then I think, so it's important to have a plan and important to have a good death idea. And I think everyone sitting in the room, no one wants to die, but perhaps they've all thought about what their good death is. My good death is very much based on my grandfather-in-law, who lived to 98 and gave up vegetables at 80.
Oh, really?
All he had was Kentucky Fried Chicken and whiskey for the last 18 years of his life, and fell asleep under the kotatsu in Japan one afternoon, and that was it.
He might have got a letter to the Queen if he'd kept going with vegetables.
I mean, but letter for the Queen, Kentucky Fried Chicken. I mean, which one are you going to... But, you know, so I think the concept of a good death is desperately important because it's a right and it's something we should fight for.
And desperately subjective, going by that.
It's desperately subjective, but it's a tool to fight for better death care. It is really, really important that we have this idea that everyone has a right to a good death.
Chloe is troubled by the Kentucky Fried Chicken diet in the latter years of life.
I'm troubled by good death. There's just so much pressure.
Okay.
I mean, we've got so much pressure already in terms of, you know, how we live, and there's this sort of almost feels like this competitive thing. It's a sort of like an individualized kind of, you know, competitive thing of like good, better, best.
Right till the very end.
Right till oh, Jesus, can't you just, you know, cark it without so much?
It's a competition, right? So it's important that we have this concept so we can fight for it. We can fight for better death care, but at the same time, you know, life is hard enough.
Yeah.
Let's not make death
graded
on a scale as well.
Too, you realise how political death is, you know.
Yeah, that's right too.
And
so I had a fairly, I suppose, modern death experience recently where a Facebook friend of mine died unexpectedly. as it turns out, I had interviewed this person as part of my job in the past, but I'd never met him in person, and we became Facebook friends through my work, but actually we became genuine friends who corresponded enthusiastically. We argued about politics on Facebook and we spoke about popular culture and stuff. And when I moved to Melbourne, I had decided that I would meet this person and go and have coffee with them. Alas, it never happened because he died unexpectedly. And I was really rocked by his death, actually. And it caused me to think about the nature of that relationship and death, and do we trivialise those kinds of what do we know about how people grieve social media friends? Is that a thing that we know much about?
I mean, it's been happening for decades now, really, when you think about it. More and more, I think every couple of years we update the statistic, but there will be some tipping point at which there are more dead people on Facebook than there are alive people.
Wow.
Right, because the younger generations are not on Facebook.
Yeah.
And the older generations are dying. I always feel bad when I say this.
No, it's true. It is.
But, at some point, Facebook will be more dead people than alive people. And is it then a digital cemetery? Is it then a digital memorial space more than a social network?
It is very much. That's true. It is very much a kind of. It's my generation that's on Facebook increasingly. So yeah, and we're closer to death than
Is there some way you can lay flowers at on the Facebook?
You can
website?
memorialise the page, and there's a whole thing about that. And everyone should choose a legacy contact. If you haven't done that on Facebook, go and have a look at how to do that. It's very important.
So that's all about when you die, your presence lives on, and so you want to have
unless
some.
you choose it not to, you can actually select to have it detonate and not be there anymore, or you select someone who sort of has control over the page after you die, so they can choose to, how you sometimes see in loving memory of, it turns to that. And then they can control friend requests, because I've got a couple of friends who have died who I'm their legacy contact, because I'll say, let me show you how to do it. And they're like, just make it you. So it's sad though, because people do friend up someone who's died. I guess they miss them, or, I sort of unfriend them because I hate their birthday popping up. One good thing is if you have the in memoriam page, it doesn't do that, because that's very sad, as we know.
It is, and it happens. Yeah.
It's really sad when you're like,
but the good thing is their mememory lives on.
The memory lives
so
on,
So you can always add to it, you can always do birthday wishes, and so they're still very much with you, know, so then they're not forgotten.
Yeah. Just quickly on do people, honour people's funeral wishes, if I may. I reckon they go out of their way. People will get really hung up about trying to do someone's funeral wishes. We had a woman that wanted to have a sea burial, which is very hard to do. Not impossible. People say it's impossible, but it's not. But it will cost you from Melbourne about $25,000, and you need to go down to Warrnambool. But they wanted to do, and they had to do all this stuff because she was at the coroner, so they had to wait to find out why she died. And so we had to do the full Egyptian natron salts, because you can't embalm someone if they're going to be put in the sea. So we had to do all of that, and it went on for months and months. And in the end, it was just going to be too prohibitively expensive. And the woman was like, I want to be driven along the ocean road in a white, she had the whole thing, but she hadn't really left provision for that financially. But they were trying to make it happen. So I just wanted to say, people I'm always amazed at how seriously they do take people's wishes.
Yeah. And the cost of funerals is something we haven't really spoken about. And I mentioned to you, Stacey, earlier that there has been a controversy around a company that's been ripping off Indigenous people, in relation to their...
So that's the UPLA insurance.
Yeah.
And there was
many thousands of people got caught up in that.
25,000 people plus that were affected by this. So they all lost their funeral insurance. There was people that were paying for, over 20 years, and then one day the company's no longer and they're not covered. And now we're starting to get them funerals through. So, you've got families who thought they were covered and now they're not. And it was... what they actually done, they targeted Aboriginal people saying they were Aboriginal company, and they weren't. And then it folded. So one thing that has come up is the government has stepped in and they're going to honour some of it, but that's only until November next year. So the people that live longer than that, I don't know what's going to happen, you know, they're just going to have to start re-saving or...
It's a terrible story.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of time left. Chloe, I wanted to just finish up on Bedtime Story, which you wrote so that you could find the words to talk about this most difficult of subjects. But reading the book, I realised it was as much about you finding some light for yourself, some path through this dark, uncertain period as well. And I just wonder, quite apart from how helpful it was talking to the kids, what conclusion you reached about how stories can get us through these dark times and give us some form of guidance. I mean, you can talk about that relating to your children, but what about you as well and what you were feeling?
Well, I think that the key thing about stories is that, we all come from storytelling cultures, and we have we're lucky to be on land with a particularly rich storytelling tradition.
Yep.
But the story lives on. It's the story that survives. It's the story. The storyteller might not be around, but here is a message in the bottle with that comes through the generations and that carries our most important and consoling and rich cultural advice, and that's they are in our inheritance.
Mm. And your book really stands as a time capsule of a period of time in your family's life too, doesn't it? I wondered, have your kids, maybe perhaps your oldest, read the book?
Not yet, but
Yeah.
I feel that that's the most important thing, that actually one day if he, that a story can also sort of, capture people's likenesses and spirit, and that's the wonderful thing about reading, that you actually do. It's the one way, and in storytelling, hearing stories, that we meet our dead and we go to the underworld and share in our knowledge, and that's what our stories can give us.
Eloquently put. Thank you to all of our fantastic speakers tonight. I should also say copies of Chloe's book are available for purchase, thanks to the bookseller Neighbourhood Books, who's selling the books. Then can I also thank the Wheeler Centre, who presented tonight's event, and thanks to the Contemplative Studies Centre at Melbourne University. This discussion will appear on Big Ideas in the weeks to come. Look out for it on the website. Thanks for coming along. I'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thank you.